You're listening to episode 128, Recovering from Abuse to Live a Full Life with Larry Rule. Welcome to the Grass Gets Greener podcast, the show for survivors by survivors. I'm your host, Melissa Wilson, a bullying survivor and anti-bullying advocate. And each week you'll hear from a survivor who has overcome a traumatic experience to go on to not only survive, but thrive, so that you can too, starting now. Hey there, welcome, and thank you for tuning into this episode. I have a great episode for you today. We're going to be joined by Larry Rule, author of Breaking the Rules, a memoir. And before we get into it, I do just want to mention that this episode is sponsored by Naavni. Naavni is the top-ranked anonymous writing website in the world. Naavni provides free wellness resources and low-cost online therapy services to help people cope with various levels of emotional distress. Write anonymously, feel better at novni.com. So Larry's memoir has recently been published, and he's going to share some of his story with us today that he's written about in his book, about being sexually abused by his father growing up and having a mother who suffered from mental illness and the impact that this complex trauma had on his life. And I do want to issue a trigger warning for anyone who's been sexually abused. You might find some of what Larry shares to be triggering to you, so just want to mention that. And in particular, what we're going to talk about here today, Larry's going to share what happened when he first tried telling someone about what he was going through. He's going to talk about how he felt the need to be a people pleaser as a child. He's going to talk about how it was going to kindergarten where he first understood shame and secrets and having to hide. He'll talk about how he felt guilty when he left home. He'll talk about the struggle he's had with his sexuality because of the abuse by his father. He'll talk about how going to therapy got him to confront what he went through. He'll talk about the role that connecting with other survivors has played in his healing. He'll also share a little bit about his struggle with alcoholism. And we'll talk about the importance of reaching out for help and what led Larry to writing his book, and also a sneak peek into his future plans. So if you've experienced the effects of complex trauma or boundary violations or abuse by a family member, then I know this episode will resonate with you. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it, and I'll go bring Larry on. Larry, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me here today to share your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have you here, and I'm glad that we got connected. And I know you have a book that came out recently called Breaking the Rules, a memoir, where you talk about what you went through growing up. And so, we'll talk about that as we're talking today. And I think your story is going to resonate with listeners and give them hope. And I know your story will particularly resonate with those who experience, boundary violations or abuse from their family. And I know that you have been sharing your story because you want to support other survivors in moving past their shame and guilt and trauma. And you say that victims shouldn't have to hold in their stories to protect their perpetrators. So it's great work that you're doing, Larry, and I know it's going to help someone who is listening right now. And so what I like to do is have you share with us about what you experienced growing up, and then we'll go from there and get into the rest of your story and what's helped you to get to where you are today. How does that sound to you?
That sounds great to me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just kind of, let us know what happened and how old you were.
Great. Yeah, I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia in a neighborhood called Levittown, where all of the houses were built to look identical. And I was always under the false illusion that that meant that everyone's lives were sort of identical and perfect as well. But what I quickly started to understand as a very young boy was that behind closed doors, it was a very different story for us. My mother suffered from undiagnosed at the time mental illness and was completely irrational and unstable and unpredictable and would violently beat my father. And it took my sister and I on many occasions took us interrupting them to break up their fights. And in those times, my mother wouldn't even see that her children were there. She just sort of seemed glazed over. And my father would be, bloodied and beaten and, just basically ask his children to love him and to comfort him and to nurture him and to love him no matter what. And
Is it just you and your sister?
yes, just two of us. And she's 6 years older.
Okay.
And my father, in turn, started sexually abusing me before I even started kindergarten. My earliest memories are of 4. And I use kindergarten as my example because it was going to kindergarten class where I first understood shame and secrets and having to hide. And, it was a deeply impactful time for me. And so while my mother was, this irrational, frightening person, my father sought comfort with me. And I think one of the things that's so important about my story is that my dad was not this violent, scary guy lurking around a neighborhood. My dad was somebody that was well-liked, respected, extremely charming, and really gave the illusion that we were the perfect family and that, he and his son had this special bond. And he really groomed me to believe that that was true and that what happened between us had to stay between us.
And did anyone know about what was going on at this time?
That's a question that really plagues me still, to this day. And, there was one point in second grade when I did tell a teacher that things were not good at home. She noticed I was falling asleep and I was just not right. I was also a very sickly kid all the time. And the teacher, of course, did what she was supposed to do and called home to my parents. And that night we were sat down and told to never, ever speak outside the home of anything that was happening. And so that was like my one attempt. And I was brought into this feeling of extra shame that I had actually told on my parents.
Were you and your sister able to talk about it with each other?
My sister was like my biggest ally. Anytime the fight started, I sought protection in her room. It was her room that I went to and, slept on her floor. And we became this unit. We were incredibly close. But she and we had to tread very lightly on what we talked about. My mother was just one of those people that, if you whispered or if she thought you were talking about her, it made her extremely paranoid, which could easily bring on her temper. And, in all of this, my mother was never violent to me. She never hit me. There was one occasion where she brutalized my sister that was horrifying and forever changed me, as well as my sister, as you can imagine. And, but, my mom really used me as her ally and a nurturer. And it was really, talk about boundary violation. I mean, it sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how was it for you to be in school at this time? I mean, was it affecting your ability to do well while you were in school?
It was. And, I missed a lot of school. I was sick a lot as a kid, especially with like tonsillitis and infections. And I had stomach problems and, all of those things that I saw, even as an adult, when I looked back on my childhood years, I thought, what a weakling. There I was judging myself as a young boy, for always being sick. But truthfully, based on what was happening, it was no wonder that I was always sick. So I struggled in school. I was a really skinny kid, pale, my ears stuck out. I was, called Dumbo all the time. And I learned to do sort of what I learned to do at home was try to make people like me, and went above and beyond to try to be charming and try to find something about people that, that I could relate to and make them like me. And it became like a full-time job as a kid.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that. When I was being bullied in school, it became my mission to do whatever I thought I needed to do to make them accept me, right? So they wouldn't bully me anymore.
That's right. I completely get that.
Yeah. And that's exhausting. And
yes,
it also just, it makes it so difficult for you to understand who you are, especially at that age, you're trying to figure out who you are, and it just confuses you.
Right.
And
Melissa, it's so funny because for me, I learned that at home. I learned that, to in order to not have my mother get angry with me, to stay in her good graces, it was like bring her flowers, bring her coffee. When she was, hungover in bed, my sister and I would have to apologize to her. Um, so there was this people pleasing that I
Mm-hmm.
learned at such a young age
Mm-hmm.
that I then took into school. I took through into my teachers, into the classroom, and certainly something that carried on into my adult life and my earliest career
Mm-hmm.
of, learning to do that. And it was a skill that I learned as a kid,
Yeah. And that,
survival skill, really.
yeah, and it's one that becomes difficult to break later on as an adult.
Absolutely. That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. So, how long did the abuse go on for?
You know, that's a tough question because I used to say like the most violent parts of what he did to me sexually happened before I was 8. But truthfully, the shift of what was ongoing until my early teens was this smothering love that he would do. And, it became this I love you so much, um, the kissing my neck and the affectionate part. And that's what was so hard and confusing. It was so difficult because I spent years and years and years, confused about what felt okay and what didn't. Where did the boundary get crossed and where was it okay? What was normal for a father to do and what was not normal? And it took me a very long time to untangle all of that. And unfortunately, I ended up being sexually abused by my mother's best friend's son when I was not yet, had not yet hit puberty. And I remember when that happened to me thinking, I've already been through this. I already know that this has happened to me. And that was really tough. Puberty was a very challenging time for me when it finally did come, and I was a late bloomer.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said earlier that it was when you went to kindergarten that you realized that what was going on at home wasn't really normal or what was supposed to be happening.
That's
Is that
right.
right?
Yes.
What was it that allowed you to have that realization at that age?
Forgive me. This is a little bit of a detail that's hard for me to say, but I'm going to say it. I just wanted to give a forewarning. But I was afraid to go to the bathroom because there was blood in my underwear,
Mm,
and I was afraid someone would see, and I was afraid that I would be found out. And I felt even at a young age that I had done something wrong every time that would happen.
mm-hmm.
No,
Oh, it's
yeah.
no. Well, thank you for sharing. It's such a terrible thing for someone that age, for a child to go through and have
Yeah, and
to.
as hard as it is to talk about, I think it's important because I wonder, like I just, one of the reasons why I feel it's so important to share is maybe as a result of talking about it, some teacher, someone, an aide, a parent, someone else will notice something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what my real hope is that by sharing those kind of details that are somehow, sometimes hard to hear, that maybe it would allow someone to see something or notice something going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of, shift now into as you're getting older, becoming an adult, in what ways were you being affected by what you had gone through as you were a child?
Now imagine this. I love that question. Imagine this one. It's like I'm in this, difficult, traumatic house with my volatile mother and my father, and I finally, am graduating high school and I have the opportunity to go to college, right? It's like my big escape plan. And I allowed myself to be guilted into staying home.
Mm,
And, that to me, and when I was writing the book and talking about that, that to me was such a glaring example of how manipulated I was. It was from both of my parents pleading with me, don't leave us, don't leave me, don't leave me alone with him, don't leave me with her. And, each of them, coming to me with their own needs, saying, please don't go. And so I stayed home for 2 additional years and went to community college and was completely lost and confused. And when I finally got up the courage to go away to college, I went to a design school, went to the Fashion Institute of Technology. I bore the brunt of my mother calling me a sissy and my father, not being able to look at the financial aid package, not being able to talk about me going away to college, and not being active participant at all. And I was, really on my own.
Was your sister still home at this time?
By that time, she was married and moved out, and she was on her own in her own apartment. And thank God that it happened. My first summer home, after I'd been away and living in New York City for a year, my mother had gone through my things and read a journal of mine, and she outed me and as a gay man, and it was highly disturbing and abusive. So I actually took shelter with my sister's house and refused to live with my parents ever again.
Wow. Yeah, and you must have just been wanting to get out of that house so badly, just to be able to just have that independence and go find yourself, right? And
that's right.
Escape what you were going through.
Yes, and because it was so ingrained in me that that I had these parents that loved me and supported me, and I was getting all of these constant mixed messages. Like I spent so many years thinking, wait a minute, am I crazy or is the situation crazy? Like how do I understand it? How do I look at this? And for a long time, I trusted some inner instinct that told me it was time to go and time to get out. And that instinct really didn't let me down. It was very challenging at times.
I was going to ask, was it scary for you to do that though?
Absolutely. And I felt tremendous guilt that I had disappointed my parents. I would come home when I was at college and, I'd walk in the door and my father wouldn't get up and he would just look sort of defeated. And I would say, what's wrong? And he would say, you're going back tomorrow. You're going back tomorrow. You're leaving me so soon. And it was just this, but I just got home, question. And it was my mom. It was my mom was, what did you bring me home? Did you bring me a present? Are you taking me out to dinner? It was really really challenging for me to break away from them.
Yeah. Yeah. My parents were very kind of overbearing and protective of me, to the point where, it held me back. And my mother, I think she would have me just live with her for the rest of her life.
Sure.
And so I can, relate to that in some ways. And, I didn't leave home for the first time until I was 25.
Wow.
I went to college locally and commuted. And there was that guilt too when I did leave. And so it makes it even more difficult, especially when, you might still be confused about who you are and you're trying to figure that out, still trying to work through the effects of what you've gone through. And then you have that happening where you're just not able to leave the home, or you feel guilty about leaving the home.
Right.
And I think it just, it makes it even more challenging. I think makes it take even longer to become independent and to figure out who you are.
Absolutely. And, add on top of that, and just the logistics of trying to understand and make that work and gain independence, but being completely confused about my sexuality and having my mother confront me about my sexuality before I was even remotely ready to talk about it, or before I even understood who I was. And, that had long lasting effects as well.
Mm-hmm. How difficult has it been for you to, kind of embrace who you are as a gay man, given the abuse that you experienced from your father? It
has been, at times it has felt like I would never truly grasp it or understand. I really struggled, especially as I was coming to terms with what happened with my dad. I just thought, I just do not want to be gay anymore. And, how am I going to find my path here as a gay man, knowing that my father was the one to have done these things to me? Am I ever going to feel safe with a man? Should I go back to dating women? I had been in relationships with men and women both. My attraction has always gone more towards men. But in those difficult times, I really questioned myself, and I said, okay, maybe it's time to have an arrangement with a woman, to feel a safety, to be in a heterosexual relationship that will feel protective and not threatening. And during these hardest questions, I was already in a relationship with my partner, who is now my husband, and we had some very difficult times to work through. And quite honestly, Melissa, it feels like a miracle that our relationship has survived for, we're going on 20 years this year.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you so much. It feels like a
That's awesome.
monumental achievement for me, for him, for us as a couple. But,
Hmm.
it was because he was willing to do the work with me. That's really how we survived.
Mm. That's so important, isn't it? When you're in a relationship with someone and you're still healing, um, you really need them to kind of be there to support you and help you through that. Otherwise, it can make things really difficult or maybe even impossible.
Right. And I think that one of the important things to mention too is that, he knew my parents. I had blocked out so much of my memory. It wasn't until my mid 30s that I started really falling apart, coming to terms with what had happened to me. And my parents were in our lives as well. So all of a sudden I'm cutting off a relationship with my father. My mother disowns me, and I'm having to say to my partner, I'm needing space, but I can't talk about it yet. And it was really difficult, to navigate all of those years of uncertainty and trying to establish, my own independence, and at the same time come to terms with what I was remembering, which was
Hmm.
horrible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So this was in your mid 30s, you said,
Yes.
when things started to kind of fall apart. So what happened there?
I was running my own business, and I had a retail home furnishings, interior design, antique store business locally here in the Hudson Valley. And I was suffering from a terrible anxiety problem and panic attacks. I started getting panic attacks in the car, especially, which is extremely inconvenient, by the way. And they would hit me, and I would end up in these dangerous situations, slowing down to 30 miles an hour on the highway, driving in the opposite lane. I mean, terrible situations. And he sensed that something was wrong. I was volatile, I was emotional, and he suggested I see a therapist. And that's what started my shift. I went into a therapist thinking, I'm going to ask her to help me with understanding better boundaries around my family. I'm going to nip this in the bud. I'm going to be fine. And of course, we all think we are in control. We're planning it out. And my therapist saw a very different scenario and slowly helped me, talk about what was really going on. And it took me months to admit that I was having panic attacks and anxiety. I was afraid she was going to tell me I needed medication, which indeed I did. But I viewed it at the time, that if I needed medication, I was no different than my mother. And I really
Mm.
struggled with, identifying with her that way. But
Hmm.
but as soon as my panic attacks and my anxiety got under control, my memory started coming back.
Mm.
Yeah. And then it was, it was facing some very difficult years of understanding, looking at these things and all of these instances in my body response to being around my father and my anxiety when they were around, and really starting to look at it for what it was, and understanding that what all of those memories and the things that I thought, um, made me troubled and made me sick in some way, uh, were all in truth what happened.
Hmm. So up until this point, were you not having a lot of memories of what had happened?
I'd have little flashbacks. I'd have these moments. Like, one of my earliest ones was, a relationship, an intimate relationship I ended up with a man when I was still in college, and I had one of my first flashbacks then, and I thought, wow, why did that just happen? And and of course, what I immediately learned to do was to numb it out with alcohol, and I would drink until the memory went away, until I could just numb out completely. And so I would have these moments, and I'd have these triggers and flashbacks and these moments of very clearly understanding what had happened, but convincing myself that I was wrong. And it all caught up with me, and I could no longer deny what was true.
Hmm. Then you had to kind of face it and
I
and
did.
deal with it.
I did. And
Hmm.
and the way that started is I remember very clearly of, saying, one of the first things that my dad did to my therapist. And it was just about, it was a very specific memory of being in the house and watching TV together and the closeness of him and what I remembered about his body and his closeness. And that's what really started. Once I let those words out to someone else, it was too late to turn back. And once I understood and established this trust with this therapist, I started to feel that I could say more. But there would be some times where there'd be something I needed to talk about that I would wait weeks before I was ready to say it out loud, because I was so afraid of the fact that once I said it out loud, she knew. And I knew, I felt found out, and I had to feel safe.
Right. Up to this point, you hadn't shared with anyone?
No one. No. No.
So yeah, of course, that's going to be really scary.
Yes. It was.
Yeah.
It was really scary. It was really hard to fathom because, it was also my dad, and I can't emphasize that enough of like how devastating that was for me to say, how could this have happened? He was my father. And yet at the same time saying, oh my God, my father did this to me. It was that balance of how could this have happened, but it did happen. And it took a deep emotional, physical toll on me. And, it was a lot of untangling for many years.
So was it therapy that kind of was the start of your healing journey for you?
Absolutely. I never imagined, I had been in therapy before, but I had never had an experience like this. I'd never worked with someone who was so committed to helping me. God, it just makes me choked up to say it like that. But I was, I felt so fortunate to have fallen into her hands and to have her really navigate all of it with me. And, never rushed, never pushed ever, and established some protocol in our sessions that allowed me to feel safe and allowed me to say once I was ready. There was one time when I ended up with all of our family memorabilia, all of it, like parents' yearbooks, all the photographs, everything from ancestors down. And I felt burdened by having all of these things. And I actually took all the boxes into my therapist's office, and for hours, she let me sort through and actually gave me the permission to throw things out, to get rid of them. But in doing that, it also helped me talk about what I remembered, because I had these photographs of me as a young boy with him, with my mother, with my sister. And it helped me start to frame out what was what and really start to lay it out and to understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so key too, isn't it? To have a therapist who, supports you in that way and that you feel you can trust. Because sometimes, someone can go to therapy and get nothing out of it. And it's, probably because they just aren't seeing the right person.
Sure.
So, I mean, that's great that you were seeing someone who was really able to help you.
Yes. And we had this joke in the beginning. There were a few times when, I also have a therapist who is willing sometimes to go out on a limb and push me to make sure that I'm, that I'm doing the work. I mean, that's our expression. We have to do the work. And I remember like a few times, like just saying to her, I really want to throw this pillow at you right now. And just having those moments of this is really hard to sit here and hear what you have to say. And, and it was, and I do not want to give the impression that it was all like that and all easy. There were so many times in the beginning that I wanted to quit, that I lied, that I did not want to show up, that I canceled appointment. It was really difficult. And I stayed the course with her, and she certainly stayed the course with me.
That's awesome. And we have to do the work if we want to get through it.
That's right.
That's unfortunately, I mean, that's how it has to be. But we deserve to get through it, to break through, and to heal.
That's exactly right.
Deserve to do the work.
Yes.
Even if it's challenging.
That's right. That's right.
So, what other things have you done, Larry, to help you get to where you are today?
I think that once I started to reach out and find ways to connect with other survivors, that was a big game changer for my own healing. To sit down with another survivor and to say the things that you feel ashamed of and to have them not only relate, but to say, yes, I've done that too. Or I can understand that because here's what I did. Here's how I acted out. Can you believe I tried this or I did that just to try to push out memory? And I think that has been a profound part of my healing and my recovery. Even to the point of speaking to someone recently and I'm talking about my sensitivity to sound, how sensitive I am to door slamming, to sound, to being in a loud restaurant, to feeling anxious and, in a movie theater, whatever it is, and having another survivor say, yes, here's what I do to combat that, and here's what some of my triggers are. So that's been really impactful on my healing process. I'm also a creative guy, so if I remain engaged in some creative project, that's enormously healing for me and helpful to sort of keep me on task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important, and that's why I like to do this show, because maybe there's someone listening right now who is going to benefit from you sharing what you're sharing.
That's right.
And we can all just be there to help each other and
yes,
just to not feel alone anymore.
That's right. And Melissa, you know this, and I know this. There's so much stigma to being a survivor of bullying, to abuse, to sexual abuse, to harassment. It's like unfortunately, society still tends to blame the victim. And it's so important to talk about because it's the only way we're going to start to shed some of that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What helped you with your struggle with alcoholism?
Well, I really became completely dependent on alcohol, and I reached out to a friend. I did not want to admit that I was an alcoholic. I associated that with my mother, somebody who was out of control and a mess, and I did not want to feel that way. And once I actually did finally admit that I was an alcoholic, I reached out to a friend who had been sober for a number of years, and he helped guide me to the right place. I'm a big fan of 12-step groups for addiction, and that has been my path.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing here is just the importance of reaching out for help, whatever it is you need help with, right?
Yeah, and that's right. And
we can't do it alone.
No, and you and I can say that, and I know for listeners, and I know even for myself in the beginning, how hard it was to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's one thing I can urge anyone to do is actually just do it, to reach out for help, however that looks like. And in the beginning, when I was needing help and I was too ashamed to say anything out loud, I did find support on certain online resources. Male Survivor, of course, was one at the time for me.
Mm-hmm.
The RAINN Network, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, they have a great website and a place that, you can find resources and help. So that was a way of reaching out for help that no one had to know that I was doing it. I didn't have to talk about it out loud. No one had to see my face. It was an anonymous way to start the process of asking for help. And that was really profound for me.
Yeah, you don't have to do it publicly. It doesn't have to be some big thing. It's just, but it's that shame that keeps us from doing it.
That's exactly right.
And it's unfortunate because, we deserve to receive that help.
Yes.
And so yeah, I mean, talking about it is great. Just you and I talking right now is great. We're helping to reduce that stigma that's out there so that people can feel more free to go out there and ask for help and not feel ashamed to do so.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Larry, tell us, how are you doing today? Are there things that you're still struggling with?
I'm doing well today. Obviously you can imagine, writing this book was a deeply, powerful and painful experience for me. And it definitely took its toll. Now that it's out, I'm feeling much more grounded. I feel willing to talk about my story. I'm doing well. But yes, I think that there are certain things that will always linger, that will always stay with me. I can give you an example of, I can have a hard time if I'm around kids or if I am in a place where I hear or see kids crying or in some distress. I immediately go into that hypervigilant mode of what's wrong? How can I help? And that's a reminder. That can be a daily reminder. If I'm in a restaurant, there's a child crying, and there's something, I immediately want to say, does someone need help here? And I have to watch that, of course. And, that's something that stays with me, that is a reminder of my own experience. Um, Relationships have been challenging for me, and boundaries and watching, but I say that, and I'm so fortunate to have these rich friendships and people in my life that help nurture me and support me. So, I think that all in all, said and done, considering the path up until now, I feel like I'm doing pretty damn well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And tell us more about your books. I know it just came out very recently, as we were talking before we started to record. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure.
Kind of what led you to writing it, and what people can kind of take away from reading your book.
Sure. I about 3.5 years ago, I was struggling with some anniversary triggers. Social media. It's like Father's Day would come around every year, and the accolades and the "I love you, Dad" and all of the posts, and I always struggled with Father's Day. It was a deeply disturbing time for me as a child. Father's Day with my dad. And as a young adult, I was finding that I was still struggling, not with feeling anger and rage and sick and just all of it. So I actually chose 3.5 years ago to start writing on Father's Day, writing out my story of exactly what he had done. In linear format, I did it for me. I had no intention of it going any further. And I found that I did feel a little bit lighter after I had done it. So I very carefully, many months later, tried it again and wrote a little bit more. And through that process, I started to feel that there was potential to really dive in and tell my story. And the universe stepped in and took over. And all of a sudden, I was on this path of writing a book. And it just came out last week. It's called Breaking the Rules. And I chose to use my last name in the title as a real, sort of a form of empowerment, to say it is time for me to break the silence that I was told as a child was so important. And so Breaking the Rules is about breaking the family contract. And I've decided to share my story open and honestly, and to tell the most shameful pieces, because I think that's what people relate to. And also with a message of you can heal, you can live a full life, and you can recover. So that's, when I finally started to understand the direction that the book was going, I started to feel a purpose with what I was doing. And my therapist helped me at the time. She actually said, "Is it the kind of book that you wish that you had to read when you were first coming to terms with what happened to you?" And when I said yes, she basically said, "That's the only answer you need."
Mm-hmm.
And I decided to publish.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I know you were saying that, you've been getting some feedback on it already, and it's been mostly positive for you, and it's already been reaching people. So that's really great.
Yes, the outreach has been amazing. And, hearing from people that I have known for 10, 20, 30 years saying me too, and, knowing them and never knowing that we shared that in common. And there's real power there when you can look someone in the eye and understand what they've been through without having to say much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know your book kind of, it doesn't shy away from the details of what you went through. How did you decide how much to include in it?
Oh, that was tough. The editor that I worked with very early on, when I had finished my first rough draft, and I thought, okay, all done. I've said it. And then, of course, she read it and she said to me, "You have told us your story very well. But now, if you're going to do this, you need to go back and show us how it felt." And I just cried. I knew what she was asking of me, and I just cried for a few days and really questioned whether or not I was going to do it. And I knew what she was saying. I had to go to those painful moments. I had to relive the experience in order to share it, because I think that that's where the richness of the story happens. I think that that's what someone's going to read and say, "Wow, I felt the same way." Or, my mother did that. Or, I knew somebody who this happened to. And one of the things that I had not really considered, and it sounds silly since I wrote the book, but it's equally about my mother's mental illness as it is my father. It's definitely both. And I think that was important to tell, of how how both of those pieces of the equation worked together to work against me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, just being able to share vulnerably like you do in the book is, yeah, like you say, it's what's going to allow people to connect with you and your story and,
Yes.
to feel like they're not alone and that you understand what they're going through.
Yes, and I had hoped to do that also, by continuing that pattern and talk about how it affected me in terms of identifying um, as a gay man, or my confusion around my sexuality, and also just into my addiction, into my alcoholism, my reliance on pills, and then beyond that, how I started to come out of all of that, what the actual process of surviving looked like for me, the decision to not commit suicide, those raw moments of vulnerability, as difficult as it was to say those things and to find the words to put those thoughts together. I I know enough other survivors to know that that's what people, I think, need to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to give them that hope, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, that's great. That's really great. I'm glad that, you were able to put it into a book because I know that's going to reach a lot of people that way. So Larry, tell us about, what it is you do today. What else do you have going on?
Well, I can't believe I'm about to say this out loud, but I swore through this whole process I would never write another book. And that is shifting. I'm starting to.
When's it coming?
I know. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I met
Okay.
with that same editor, recently, and we started talking. And of course, as far as she was concerned, she wanted another book out of me a year ago, and I just couldn't even think about it. But I am thinking about continuing writing. Um, I also am definitely looking to sink a little deeper into a new creative project. I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like yet, but there's something brewing for me that I can feel that's going to be, I'm a visual guy. I'm like an interiors, and, I like three-dimensional things. And even though I'm no longer working on people's houses, I still am always looking for a space to recreate. And I relate that back to my childhood, the need to create safety and beauty in wherever I am,
Hmm.
to have a space, have a certain aesthetic and feel nurtured by it. Um, I'm one of those people. I'm definitely not a minimalist. Yeah.
All right. Well, very exciting, and we'll look forward to whatever it is that you have coming up next.
Thank you.
So, Larry, I want to ask you the final question that I have for you today,
Sure.
and that is, given what you know now, if you could go back to when you were going through your tough times and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
I would tell, I would say to rely on your instincts. Trust them, and they will not steer you wrong. That's what I would say.
Hmm.
And I would say that still holds true to me now. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's such an important one, and it's also such a difficult one too, right? Because
Oh, yeah,
it, right? I mean, when you go
it
through that
is.
stuff, like you question your instincts,
Right.
right? So it becomes difficult to trust them afterwards.
One of the things, and I've heard this from other people that have spoken, and I know it's a shared common theme, but I did go through that period of, why did this happen to me? And how could this have happened, and why? And to understanding now, like as a survivor, somebody who's focusing on finding ways to thrive, to be able to say, okay, you know what, it didn't kill me. The actual, abuse didn't kill me, and neither did the traumatic effects later. So I'm still here. So how can I continue to make my life richer?
Hmm. It's like you made it through the worst part, right? So
Yes,
now it can only get better from here,
absolutely. That's how
and
I
we're
believe.
and we're in control of that now.
That's right.
Yeah, and
That's
yeah,
wonderful.
definitely
Thank you.
trust your instincts, absolutely, because
Yes.
our instincts, I think that they've always been there to serve us, and we've just, we can lose touch with that sometimes as we go through this, but if we can reconnect to them and just reconnect to who we are and what we know to be true, then that can serve us so powerfully.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Awesome. So what is the best way for people to, connect with you or find out more about what you have going on?
Sure. I created a website for the book called breakingtherules.com, and rules is spelled like my last name, Ruhls. And on there, I include resources and a way to contact me, and social media connections, whatever it is. And I'm happy to take any emails or questions from anyone listening that might want to reach out.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for coming on here today and for sharing your story with us, and for all the work that you're doing to reach other survivors, to let them know that they're not alone, and there's hope for things to get better. So thank you, Larry.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
All right. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to the show today. This has been the Grass Gets Greener podcast, episode 128. Go to thegrassgetsgreener.com/Larry Ruhl, and Ruhl is spelled Ruhl, to find the links mentioned during this episode or to leave a comment. So I hope you enjoyed this episode with Larry and were able to take something away from it that can support you in your own situation. And I just want to reiterate the importance of reaching out for help if you need it. I know it can be scary, but you deserve to receive that support toward your healing. And just know that you don't have to feel shame. It wasn't your fault. So I encourage you this week to take one step toward reaching out for any help that you need. And come back in 2 weeks for the next episode. Also, head over to the website to grab your free copy of the Top 10 Strategies Guide for Survivors. In it, you'll find the top 10 most common strategies my podcast guests have used for overcoming the effects of past trauma. It's a great place to get started if you're looking for some strategies that can help you in your healing, as they have helped my guests. And you can find that at thegrassgetsgreener.com/guide, or also on the show notes page. So be sure to grab that if you haven't yet. And lastly, don't forget to head over to iTunes or Stitcher to leave the show a rating and review so that we can reach as many survivors as possible. And, as always, have hope.